Okay, so we've talked about the brain. And when we talked about the brain, we talked about the cerebrum, we talked about the diencephalon, we talked about the brain stem, and we talked a little bit about the cerebellum. Those are all parts of the brain. And then we're going to talk about the spinal cord. And those all represent neurons in the central nervous system. So we have a skull and we have vertebrae. And the brain is sitting inside that skull, and the brain stem leaves that skull, and when it leaves the skull, it becomes the spinal cord. Okay, so that's what we've been spending time talking about. That stuff in the green is our central nervous system. So our spinal cord is going to also have gray matter and white matter. Remember, we said the cerebral hemisphere was pretty much all white matter centrally, with a bunch of gray matter pushed up against the outsides. The outside 2 to maybe 4 millimeters or so is all gray matter. When we look at the spinal cord, we're also going to see gray and white matter. And the gray matter is neurons, and that applies to the cerebral hemisphere as well. Neurons and unmyelinated fibers, and the white matter is myelinated fibers. And you know, I mean nerve fibers when I say fibers, right? Everybody's good with that. So generally, the spinal cord is generally arranged as central gray matter. So you can see up here with what we drew here, the gray matter was out in the outside edges and the white matter was central. So, and the peripheral is white matter. So just the opposite of what we saw up in the brain. I'm going to show you a picture of this in a minute. And also, generally, dorsal, which is interchangeable with posterior, is typically going to be sensory, and ventral, interchangeable with anterior, is most often going to be motor in its responsibilities. So spinal nerves So spinal nerves are going to come and go from the spinal cord. If they enter the spinal cord on the backside, then they match up with what we said. They're going to be sensory. When they exit through the ventral route at the front, they're going to be motor. Okay, so what that's going to look like is if we look at the spinal cord, so let's just draw the bottom of the skull here. Okay, and the spinal cord is going to leave, whoops, I don't want that color. It leaves there's a big hole in the base of the skull. It's called the foramen magnum, big hole. And the spinal cord leaves. And it travels through the cervical spine. Remember, there were 7 of those. Then it travels through the thoracic vertebrae. And it gets a little narrower as it descends. And we'll explain why in a minute. Then it enters into the lumbar spine, and it's only in the first 2 segments or so before it starts to split up into individual nerve fibers. And I've kind of spread them out. They're not going to spread out like that because they still stay in the lumbar vertebrae. But this back end is the end of the spinal cord itself, and it's literally called the horse's tail, the cauda equina, and that's at about the level of the 2nd lumbar vertebrae. But between every vertebrae, including the skull and C1, there's going to be a pair of nerves. Now, because they're nerves, they are not part of the central nervous system. They are part of the peripheral nervous system. So we'll talk about those and how they match up in a few minutes. But let's take a look at this spinal cord. So it's a solid mass of nervous tissue until we get to L2. Okay, and if we looked at a cross section, so if we take out a cross section, okay, we're going to look at it now from a cross section. We're taking a slice of the spinal cord. And at the back, so this will be dorsal. I'll label it in a minute. Let's just back that up a little bit. Try to keep it more or less okay, that should get us our general organization. Now that central little canal I just drew is going to have fluid in it. Anybody remember what that fluid's called?
CSF? Spinal fluid?
That's right. Both of you are right. It's cerebral spinal fluid, abbreviated CSF. So it's not only going to be found in that central canal where it provides some nutrition, but it's going to be found between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater around the outside of this spinal cord as well. So this represents the spinal cord, and we're going to, we're going to have, this is anterior and this is posterior. Okay, so we're going to have a root that enters the spinal cord on the posterior side and one that leaves the spinal cord on the anterior side. Okay, so in this example, what we're going to do now is draw in our gray matter. Okay, that's our gray matter. And the outside of the gray would be white matter. So we know the white matter are tracks. If those tracks are ascending, what kind of information is being carried in them?
Sensory.
Right. And if they're descending tracks,
Motor.
that's right. So most of our ascending tracks will be found in the dorsal and the lateral columns. So those columns are just the sides. So if we say lateral column, then we're talking about laterally. Dorsal, and anterior would be anterior. And if we are able to designate bundles of fibers, then typically we're going to find that those bundles that are found laterally and posteriorly are ascending. Now, there happens to be laterally descending and anterior ascending, so there's a mix there. So you don't have to worry about that, okay? If I name a track, you're going to be able to figure out whether it's carrying sensory information or motor information. For example, there's a tract out there that's called the spinothalamic tract. If it's called the spinothalamic tract, does it sound like it's ascending or descending?
It should be ascending.
Correct. So what kind of information would be carried in that spinothalamic tract?
Sensory.
Exactly. And if I told you there was a tract that was called the corticospinal tract, does that sound like it's descending or ascending?
Descending.
Of course. And if it's descending, what kind of information is it carrying?
Motor.
Very good. How about this one? Reticulospinal. Ascending or descending?
Descending.
Exactly. If it ends in spinal, it's descending. If it starts with spinal, it's ascending. And then you know what kind of information is being carried in it. Okay, so we're right for now. That's all we need to remember. Okay, so let's take those out of there. Now, in the gray matter, we said gray matter was neurons and unmyelinated fibers. But in this gray matter, and I'm going to make this gray matter here a little bigger so we can put some stuff in there. So the gray matter is arranged in what kind of looks a little bit like a butterfly. Sometimes it's described as a bit of a butterfly. It looks like it's got wings and, you know, those big hairy extensions on the back of them that give them these four extensions, these four sort of appendages. But in the gray matter, each of these appendages represents a group of neurons. And in what we call the anterior horns, these two extensions here are referred to as horns. And in the anterior horns, we have some of the largest cells in the body. We know skeletal muscle cells especially are pretty big. But these cells are multipolar somatic motor neurons. They're going to leave through the dorsal root, okay, and they're going to travel in a spinal nerve. So remember we said that spinal nerves will leave the spinal cord through a ventral root. I might have said dorsal there. I meant anterior is ventral. Okay, so this is the direction. If it's leaving the spinal cord, then by definition, it's efferent, and we know that efferent is motor. We good with that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now, okay, somebody else?
Yeah, we're okay.
Okay.
So,
So,
just to clarify, are we recording?
yeah, can't you tell? I pressed record.
Oh, I can't tell from here. Sorry.
Well, somewhere on there, there's an indicator that it's being recorded.
No, it doesn't tell. I can see it. It says it's recording.
Okay, now this turquoise line I just drew represents the sensory input to the spinal cord. So a spinal nerve is going to have both a sensory and a motor component to it. So we'll talk about that when we get to the peripheral nervous system. But what we need to see is that this sensory neuron is entering the spinal cord, but we drew the body outside. These are sensory neurons. They can either be somatic, and you remember if they're somatic sensory, they're receiving sensation from receptors found in the skin. They're going to give us temperature and touch and that kind of thing from the skin. But they could also be visceral sensory neurons, meaning they're going to carry those same sorts of sensations, but from organs and glands inside the body. We're okay with that, right? So this structure is called a dorsal root ganglion. So dorsal because it's at the back. There's our posterior, so we know we're at the back. The root is the part of the spinal nerve that's entering the spinal cord. But there's a ganglion, a cluster of neurons just outside of the spinal cord. So part of the peripheral nervous system. It's called the dorsal root ganglion because of where it's found. And inside that dorsal root ganglion are sensory neurons. And you can tell, hopefully by the way I drew, that's kind of a mess right now. Now I'm going to draw in a different one as well to indicate visceral as well as somatic. Okay, and they're going to enter through that dorsal root. But there's a cluster of the neurons that stay outside of the central nervous system found in this dorsal root ganglion. And from the way I drew them, how would you describe these neurons? You got three options. They could be multipolar, bipolar, or unipolar.
Unipolar.
Bipolar.
They're unipolar. There's only one post, in and out. A bipolar neuron would look like this. 1, 2. This has a single post, single pole, unipolar. The sensory neurons that contribute to the spinal cord are unipolar. Okay, and we're left with one more group of, I gotta see if they're gonna show up. So the sensory neurons enter the anterior root, they enter the dorsal root and they travel into the dorsal horn of the gray matter. And sometimes they synapse right away on a second neuron, and sometimes they travel up in one of the ascending tracks towards the central nervous system, towards the brain. But these purpley neurons that I just drew in here, these are known as autonomic motor neurons. So they're going to be neurons that finish on what kind of an effector? Nobody can answer me, and it's right there, right in front of you.
Cardiac muscle, adipose tissue, glands,
And
and
Skeletal muscle.
Smooth muscles.
no, it's smooth muscle.
smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, not autonomic. Skeletal muscle will be considered somatic effector. The other effectors, all of them, once you have skeletal muscle separated, all the rest of them fall under autonomic. So autonomic motor neurons are going to ultimately finish on glands or smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or adipose tissue. That's it. Everything except skeletal muscle. And that is for the somatic motor neurons. So this represents the organization of the spinal cord. Gray matter in the middle, white matter on the outside. In a cross section of the spinal cord, we see anterior horns. In the anterior horns, we see the somatic motor neurons. They're sometimes called alpha motor neurons. But basically, if you remember somatic motor, that's going to tell you that they finish on skeletal muscle. The lateral part of these horns are for autonomic motor neurons. You got the word motor in there, so you know they're going to finish on an effector. If it's autonomic, it's everything except skeletal muscle. In the dorsal horns, we have the fibers from the sensory neurons. The neurons themselves are out in the dorsal root ganglion. This is the dorsal root. This is the ventral root. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So,
Sir.
yeah.
So you know how you're like describing or telling us all the points? Like there's the dorsal, the lateral. Which one is for the multipolar somatic motor neurons?
The ventral root is
Thank
how the neurons, the axons from those neurons leave to target skeletal muscle. I color-coded it for you.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, so ventral root is motor, dorsal root is sensory.
Sir,
Yep.
what does it say under somatic sensory nerves? The one that's like underlined in pink?
Visceral.
Oh, visceral. Okay.
So
Thank you.
that means like an organ, right? An organ?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We okay with that?
Yep.
Okay. So let's move out that spinal cord then. That's what we want to kind of remember about the spinal cord. Now what we want to talk about is out in the peripheral nervous system, spinal nerves. Because once we get the spinal nerves figured out, we can put those three boxes and arrows all together and come up with some examples that hopefully ties everything together for us. That's what we're going to try to do before we're finished here tonight. So when we look at spinal nerves, we're no longer brain or spinal cord, so we're part of the peripheral nervous system, right? That's our PNS. Now we have about 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And the spinal nerves are arranged much the same way as the muscle was. So in other words, on the outside of a nerve, there's a peri. I should say that one, the very outside is going to be our epineurium. I better not mess you up that way. And then we notice that there's bundles of nerve fibers that travel separate from other nerve fibers. And they're separated by the perineurium. And then the individual nerve fiber is separated from other nerve fibers by an endoneurium. So we can look at a single nerve fiber, an axon, that might be motor. And probably all those ones in a single bundle, remember those were called fascicles when we looked at the muscle tissue, right? Those might all be motor, so they're all heading out towards skeletal muscle. And then a different bundle is sensory, and it's carrying sensory information back to the spinal cord. So spinal nerves are described as being mixed. They have both motor and sensory fibers. Now, if they're motor, they're going to be axons that are going to finish on skeletal muscle or autonomic targets like smooth muscle or cardiac muscle. If they're sensory, they're probably dendrites heading back towards those cell bodies that we saw over here, these cell bodies right in here. So when they're coming this way, they're coming towards the cell body, they're dendrites by definition. When they leave the cell body, they're axons. So we have 31 pairs. They leave between the occiput and C1, and then between C1 and C2, C3 and C4, all the way down into the sacrum. And so they're just going to be named for the vertebrae that they're most closely associated with. The first one that leaves is C1, and then the next one would be C2, C3, and those are referred to as their nerve roots. So in the cervical vertebrae, because we start above C1, there's actually 8 cervical nerve roots, C1 through to C8. And then 12 for thoracic. That makes sense because there's 12 thoracic vertebrae. 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and on average, there's about 1 from the coccyx. So that's how we get our 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So that looks like this. 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 at the coccyx. So if we drew a little picture of our vertebrae, remember we have a vertebral body, and then we have this vertebral canal here, spinous processes, and the transverse processes. Right? Remember that was our cross section of a vertebrae? Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
So in the center of this vertebral canal is our spinal cord. Actually, you know what? I should have, I don't know if this will work. There's our white matter for our spinal cord. And our gray matter, remember our gray matter is a butterfly. So I'm going to try and draw in our butterfly here. So we're at a cross section. We're looking above a vertebrae here. And we had our motor neurons would leave anterior. So this is anterior. That's posterior. They're going to leave like this. And our sensory neuron came in this way and enters the spinal cord that way. Let's actually move this over a little closer. So our spinal nerve has a motor component to it and a sensory component. It splits right before the spinal cord into the anterior root or the ventral root and the dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion. And it's doing the same thing on the other side. So we have our sensory neuron bringing sensory into the spinal cord and the motor so that's our spinal nerve. We get just beside the spinal cord, we split into a dorsal root and a ventral root. Ventral is motor, dorsal is sensory. So that's our pair of spinal nerves at one level. If we looked at the vertebral column coming straight down, finishing in that tail at about the level of L2, leaving the skull, pair of nerves, pair of nerves, pair of nerves, pair of nerves, all the way down. 8, 12, 5, 5, 1. We get it? We okay with that?
Yes.
Okay, so these represent the spinal nerves. Remember, we mentioned cranial nerves. There's 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So, these 31 pairs of spinal nerves have the responsibility of receiving sensation from all over the body and delivering motor signals all over the body. And we arrange these routes. So they're going to be named for the vertebrae that they're closely associated with. So we call a set of nerve roots C1 nerve roots. They're from the right side, C1's from the left side. C2, C4, C6, C7, up to C8, and then T12 up to 12. L1, 2, 3, 4, 5, S1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's just how we name the nerve roots. When we combine branches from the nerve roots, we get the names of nerves. You've heard of the ulnar nerve or the radial nerve or the femoral nerve. Maybe you haven't heard of all those nerves, but that's where these nerves come from. So when we have branches from individual nerve roots form nerves, they come from what are called a plexus. So a nerve, a spinal nerve, so a spinal nerve plexus is a network of branches from nerve roots that form specific nerves. So there's four main plexuses that we want to be aware of. The cervical plexus is made up from the nerves from C1 to about C5. Okay, there's a little bit of overlap. So C4, C5 is where the cervical plexus is. So if we had C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, what we're saying is that the nerve roots from C1 and C2 and C3 and C4 and C5, they all leave and they have branches that will form nerves. So they branch and form nerves that will have specific names and responsibilities. So you see where the network comes from, the network of branches that I'm talking about. In the cervical plexus, it's C1 through C5, forming branches with nerves that have specific responsibilities. So these nerves are going to supply the chest and the upper back. They're going to supply muscles associated with the neck. Okay, and one of the most important nerves that comes out of the cervical plexus is a nerve called the phrenic nerve. Anybody heard of the phrenic nerve before?
No.
So it's made up from branches from C3, 4, and 5, and it supplies the diaphragm. Now, next semester, you'll find out that the diaphragm is a very, very important muscle associated with respiration. If we cannot contract the diaphragm, we are unable to breathe properly. Becomes life-threatening. People who fracture their neck and sever their spinal cord at the level of C4, you can see here right in the middle, are in danger of completely damaging the phrenic nerve and losing the function of the diaphragm. So this is probably the most important nerve from a life-threatening point of view that comes out of this cervical plexus. Do you follow me there?
Yes.
Okay, so if we were looking at this and we said this is 3, 4, and 5, 3, 4, and 5, we could come up with contributions from 3, 4, 5 are going to come in on this. Did I do that right? 1, 2, 3. Okay, we'll do it like that. That's got roots. We don't need this one in the middle here. So this would be our phrenic in the way that we just drew it. Three, 4, 5. Okay, now brachial plexus. You can tell from its name, brachial, that it's going to probably have to do with nerves that supply what?
Muscles.
Brachii has to do with what?
The arms.
Yep, the arm. So these are going to be nerves that supply muscles, like somebody said, but to the arm specifically. That's what brachial is telling you. So the roots that form the brachial nerve, brachial plexus, are going to come from C4 through to T1. They're going to supply to the shoulder and upper limb. This was chest and neck. Now we've got shoulder and upper limb, and they're going to have names like they form nerves like the axillary nerve. Axillary nerve is the nerve that travels through the armpit. Median, radial, ulnar nerves. You're familiar with radial and ulnar nerves. They're going to travel down on the radial and ulnar sides of the forearm and other ones along those lines. So these ones are important for motor activity and sensation from the shoulder and the upper limbs. Basically, if it travels through an area, it's going to supply the muscles in that area. Okay, now we skip through the thoracics. The thoracics don't really form plexuses other than contributing to the brachial plexus, and we'll see they contribute to this next plexus a little bit. Otherwise, the nerves that leave through the thoracics follow the ribs. So the next plexus is down at the lumbar area, lumbar plexus. And this is made up of roots from T12 to about L4. Okay, and these are going to provide sensation from the skin and to the muscles of this region, abdominal and pelvic areas. And probably a big nerve to be aware of here is the femoral nerve. which is made from the nerve roots of L2, 3, and 4, is a major nerve to the anterior thigh, to the quadriceps. So that's a major nerve that's formed from the lumbar plexus. Then we have the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is made up of nerve roots L4, 5, and S1, 2, 3. And this is going to, the nerves that come from this plexus are going to supply the gluteals. Remember, gluteus, medius, minimus, and maximus. And the biggest nerve in the body is formed from this sacral plexus, the sciatic nerve. And it's made from all of those nerve roots we just mentioned, L4, 5, S1, 2, and 3. It's about as big as your thumb in diameter, and it travels through your butt. And if you're a nurse who's going to be giving somebody an injection in their butt, you better know where that sciatic nerve is, because that sciatic nerve is big and it's an easy target. And if you stick a needle into it, your patient is not going to be very happy. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, here's a sacrum. And we're going to put our anatomy over top of our sacrum. I don't know if you can catch what I'm drawing here. It's your backside. So basically, I'm drawing the gluteal muscles. But we said the sciatic nerve comes from branches of L4, 5 and S1, 2, 3. S1, 2, 3, and L4 and L5. And it forms as a big, big nerve that runs down the back of your leg. And it supplies the whole lower limb except for the anterior thigh that the femoral nerve we mentioned in the previous plexus is responsible for. So if you're a nurse and you're ready to give somebody a needle in their backside, it's a good idea to take in this example here, we're looking at the left side, and make a mental drawing of a quadrant. In other words, take half the butt, divide it into a group of 4, and the upper outside quadrant is your safest place to give an injection, because it's the one place that the sciatic nerve is probably not going to be. But you can see the way that we've drawn this is that it's possible that it's going to be in all the other 3 quarters. You follow me on that?
Yeah.
So in your career, you're going to be given injections. You want to remember upper outside so that your patient doesn't get very mad at you or upset at you for, hitting them literally where it's going to hurt.
Sir, could you go back to the sacral plexus?
Yep.
Thank you.
So in our sacral plexus, it's literally made up of all of those roots that we saw. The sciatic nerve is made up of all those roots. Now the nerves, there's also not just nerves to the gluteals, but nerves to the external genitalia and the muscles associated with the anus and so on in that area too. Think of just what's in that region generally, and you can predict that these are the nerves that are going to be supplying those areas.
I have a question. So there's a huge gap, unless I wrote it wrong, between the brachial plexus and the lumbar plexus. The brachial plexus ends at T1 and the lumbar starts at T11. So what happens to the T2 to T11?
Okay, so I did mention that. I mentioned that the thoracic nerves follow the ribs. They don't form networks. So what they're going to do instead is follow a rib. So what they'll look like is if we had our vertebrae in here, if our vertebrae was here, okay, and remember we said our ribs, they travel like this. They went backward first and then they came around the front to the sternum, right?
Yeah.
So when spinal nerves in the thoracic spine leave the spinal cord, what they do is they come out and there's a branch that goes around behind and supplies the skin and muscles on the backside. And then the anterior branch travels forward to the front and it supplies the skin and the musculature that it passes by as it travels through that thoracic area. So if we looked at the sternum from in the anterior pituitary, I'm getting into the endocrine system already. There's our sternum, and here's a rib, and here's a rib, and here's a rib. They would each have a nerve that travels just inside the rib, so it's protected by the rib. But it branches and supplies everything through the thoracic cavity.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. So they don't network. They don't network. They just travel as individual nerves with the ribs. So with spinal nerves, then they're going to be associated with the spinal cord outside of the skull. And cranial nerves are found inside the skull. You know what? I don't want to talk about cranial nerves right now. What I want to do is put together what we've been talking about. So remember, we said that the whole nervous system can be organized into boxes and arrows, right? That's the whole nervous system right there. By now we know how to fill in everything. We don't have to write it out every single time, but we can refer to it. So here what we want to do is we want to put together a real life example of what this looks like. So let's see if I can draw for you a good example of what we're talking about. So there's a patella, okay? Here is okay, so can you tell what part of the body I'm drawing here? Anybody have any idea what I'm drawing here?
Yeah, it's a leg.
Okay, good. So you can tell. So what joint have I got pictured in here?
Knee joint.
That's the knee joint, right? Yeah. Okay, good. So we know where we are. Now, we want to put in a receptor. So what we're going to do, put a structure in there, and we're going to draw in a reflex hammer. Now, some of you have maybe had this done to you in a doctor's office. Some of you maybe not. Have you ever had a patellar tendon reflex test done?
Yes.
Okay. So you get a reflex hammer and you tap the tendon. And what we're going to see is that this receptor is connected to a nerve that's going to travel back to the spinal cord. And when it enters the spinal cord, now we can so this represents our dorsal root and our dorsal root ganglion, right? Everybody okay with that? This is taking the sensory information back to the spinal cord. Now, in a deep tendon reflex, also known as a stretch reflex, the beauty is integration is as simple as you can possibly get in the nervous system because there's only one synapse in the whole nervous system for integration. So what that means is that when we carry on into the spinal cord, there's only one synapse that we need to worry about. What color am I going to make that? And it's going to leave to supply the quadriceps. So now we've completed a picture here that has all three boxes and all pathways, the two arrows, and it represents a real-time integration, organization. All the components of the nervous system are represented here. So we start this process by tapping the tendon on the patella. So our reflex hammer taps the tendon on the patella, and then we send an afferent sensory signal into the spinal cord that synapses directly on the motor neuron and comes back out again. And what happens? Anybody who's ever had this done knows the patellar tendon gets tapped, and what does your quadriceps do?
You extend your leg.
Right, because the quadriceps did what?
Contract.
Contract.
Yeah, contracted. So it's known as a stretch reflex. The stimulus was a stretch, and the response was contraction. So that's an awful lot like stretch, contraction, stretch, contraction. What is that looking a little bit like?
Homeostasis.
Ah, there we go. Homeostasis. Good old homeostasis. Everybody loves talking about homeostasis. Well, maybe not loves it, but guess what? It's part of what we do. So let's try to label. And we've got an afferent pathway, and we've got an efferent pathway. So we have 5 segments here. Can we map those same 5 segments on our real life drawing here. So for example, where would we put our receptor?
Is it the tendon?
The tendon here where the pen mark is?
Yeah.
Okay, well that's going to get stretched.
This is
But
the-
is it represented by being connected to the nervous system?
Would it be the point of contact?
You mean from the hammer?
Like with the hammer, like to the skin?
Okay, so my question, I always hope somebody will bring the hammer up as a stimulus, because then I say, do you think that human beings have hammer receptors?
No.
Right. So, and nobody really said that. Nobody was thinking that, but I bring it up anyway, because it's called a stretch reflex. So guess what the receptor is going to measure?
Stretch?
Yeah, stretch. And that stretch receptor is what I drew in this little rectangle, in this space right here. And it's connected to our afferent pathway. So this is our receptor. And it is a stretch receptor. So the stretch was caused here. When the hammer tapped the tendon, it pulled on the patella, which pulls on the muscle. But the receptor itself is located in the tendon of the muscle, not the ligament. So we have to be anatomically accurate there. Okay, and then what is our afferent pathway? That's pretty straightforward, right? That's this one. And where's integration?
It's like in the spinal cord where the synapse is, like the one.
Yeah, right here, right? That's integration. Monosynaptic. Monosynaptic. One synapse. So what's the efferent pathway? What color?
The yellow one.
And our effector?
The quads?
Yeah. So we have all 5 components of the nervous system represented in this spinal reflex. So spinal reflexes and spinal reflexes are primitive, right? Spinal cord integration is very, very simple. So it's basically, it's sort of like your all or none. You got sensory in, motor out. There's no refining. There's no smoothing. It's a very exaggerated response, but it indicates that all your components in the nervous system are working. That's why this becomes a basic part of a physical examination, especially in offices that are measuring nervous system function or muscular function and that sort of thing. So you can do deep tendon reflexes, stretch reflexes down here at the Achilles, on the patella, in tendons of the arm, in tendons down by the ankle, and you can, in each of those cases, determine whether the 5 segments of the nervous system are functional. It's quick, it's predictable, it's reproducible. So it becomes an important part of a neurological exam, especially. So let's take a look at another type of spinal reflex. That one was called a stretch reflex. Now see if you can tell me what I'm drawing this time. So let's do a
It's a hand.
it is a hand. Okay, that's good. I'm going to put that finger out on a little bit of a bend. Okay, now so we're going to put in, whoops. And what we're going to do here is put in a muscle. And we're going to put in a muscle over on this side as well. So you know we're going to add in a little bit of complication here. I don't know what'll happen here. So what I'm just trying to do here is show you the bone. But we can appreciate that we've got muscle on either side of this joint. We got a muscle that passes in front of the joint. We got a muscle that passes behind the joint. So we know those movements are going to be opposite of each other, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what did I try to draw down here? What's that supposed to be down there?
A thumbtack.
Yeah, that's a tack. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have a pathway that enters the spinal cord. So here's a cross section of our spinal cord. White matter, gray matter. Okay, everybody with me? So far, we have our receptor. What kind of receptor would this be?
Sensory.
What kind of sense?
Pain.
That's right. This is a pain stimulus. And a pain stimulus is going to cause what we hope will be a withdrawal reflex. So it's another example of a spinal reflex. So we know that it's going to be basic or primitive. We know that it's predictable, and we should be able to reproduce it. So when we call it a withdrawal reflex, what do you think the goal is going to be?
To pull away your hand.
Right. And in this picture, what are we going to do to pull away? We're going to have to do what to what?
Attach.
Pardon me?
Contraction.
Of what muscle?
Biceps.
Right, the
Yeah.
bicep, which is this one, right? In our picture.
Yes.
We're going to shorten that in order to go away from the tack. That's what our goal is. So what's going to happen is we're going to synapse on a motor neuron that goes to the biceps. Right? And what's the neurotransmitter called that's released to the biceps to cause contraction?
ACH.
And it was excitable, right? It caused contraction. So we can put an excitable sign there. Remember at the beginning of today, we talked about excitatory and inhibitory. This is why I brought it up back then. So how is it that the neuron that is going to deliver excitation to the biceps is going to have to also inhibit the triceps? So what has to happen is we have to synapse on an intermediate neuron. I can't actually put it on that side. Let me get rid of that. It's got to come down here on a different motor neuron. So this one is going to go to the triceps muscle. Okay, now I don't know if you can see that very clearly. Can you see that okay? That I drew in a neuron in between the two in green?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's an interneuron. It's going to be an inhibitory so the synapse, so let's just go back to the biceps for a minute. The synapse between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, just like we saw for the stretch reflex, is monosynaptic. And it's going to be excitatory, right? Because we want to get contraction in the biceps. And we know that it's excitatory at the muscle so that we get contraction. Now, the motor neuron stores acetylcholine, ACH. So if it releases ACH at the triceps contracts too. And if the triceps and the biceps both contract at the same time, what's going to happen to withdrawal?
Nothing.
Nothing. That's trouble, right? We want to withdraw. So we somehow have to inhibit the triceps. So that happens with this intermediary interneuron. It has a different neurotransmitter, so it blocks the transmission to the motor neuron that goes to triceps. So triceps relaxes while the biceps contracts. But see, we got an extra neuron in there in order to change that message. If we inhibit the motor neuron to triceps, we get no signal. No signal means no contraction. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, question. I just drew in another interneuron here, which actually I shouldn't do that. Let's just leave it like it is. So now, remember we said that the stretch reflex was monosynaptic. How many synapses do you see in this integration? So integrations in this case is in the spinal cord. So you just need to count the synapses in the spinal cord.
3.
3. That's right. So now we're no longer monosynaptic, right? It's gotten a bit complicated. So we see with the withdrawal reflex that the integration is a little more complicated. But the goal is still very, very basic. It's still protection, right? In this case, the stimulus was pain. And the response was withdrawal. In our previous example, the stimulus was stretch, and the response was contraction. Looked a lot like homeostasis. In the case of pain, that's a little different. It's not going to be something that matches up with homeostasis in that case, but it is a survival reflex. And it is, in some ways, it is reversing the stimulus because you're removing the stimulus, right, when you lift away from that tack. But again, we can, if we want to look at the components of the nervous system, again, they're all represented here. Now let's just do it by numbers. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so where is number 1 in our diagram? Number 1 is receptor. So where's our receptor?
Bicep.
Our receptor is going to be bicep?
The hand,
Well, let's be a little more specific.
the palm of the hand.
What about the palm of the hand?
Pain.
Pain what? Pain what? What's this box?
Pain receptors.
Oh, receptors. Oh, box 1's a receptor. Oh, yeah. That's what he's talking about. Yeah. Now I get it. That's our number 1. Where's our number 2? You know I'm having fun, right? I'm not mad. Can't tell sometimes through the computer. What's number 2?
Is it the blue line? The top.
Don't say, is it the blue line? Tell me
is.
it is the blue line. And number 3 is going to be where? Just say where it is. Where is it happening?
The spinal cord.
Right, and specifically gray matter of the spinal cord, right? If you were asked this on a test, tell me it's the gray matter in the spinal cord, because that's where the neurons are, right? So that's where integration would be. And number 4 is represented, in this case, got to be careful here. Number 4 is represented where?
The yellow line.
And
the pink
one.
That's right. And now, for the person who answered first at the beginning incorrectly, can now answer, where would the effectors be?
Biceps.
Biceps and
triceps.
that's right. Perfect. So do you see how the organization works when we start to put it into a real-time picture?
Yes.
I sort of think, in fact, I a little more than sort of think, this would be a really good thing to remember. Being able to put these 5 components onto a real scenario. Either a picture that looks something like this, or a picture that looks something like that. In either case, we can put Let's see, something that's going to show up. Right, that's our number. Our number 1 was our receptor. Our number 2 was our afferent pathway. This circled area here was integration, number 3. Our efferent pathway was number 4. And our quadriceps is number 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See it?
Yes.
Perfect. Very good. All right, so that up to and including spinal reflexes will be on test number 3.